The Future of Power, der Geopolitik-Podcast von Agora Strategy.
Herzlich willkommen zur 20. Folge des Podcasts The Future of Power, der Geopolitik-Podcast von Agora Strategy. Mein Name ist Timo Blenk, ich bin Partner und CEO der Agora Strategy Group. Heutiges Thema ist The Middle East and Beyond. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass wir zu unserer Jubiläumsfolge, der 20. Folge, einen sehr besonderen Gast haben, nämlich Nasser bin Nasser aus Jordanien in Amman, Lead Expert für die Middle East Region und aktuelle Entwicklungen generell im Nahen und Mittleren Osten. Und daher werden wir diese Folge auch in englischer Sprache aufnehmen. Dear Nasser, thank you very much for taking the time, and it's a great pleasure having you with us in our podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here, Timo. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Nasser.
So before we jump directly into the topic, let me briefly introduce you to our listeners. So you're not only Agora Strategy's lead expert on the Middle East and geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East region, but you've held a number of different affiliations and positions in the past. So, for example, you are also an expert on the geopolitics of the Middle East region for the World Economic Forum, where you've also a few years ago have been appointed as one of their global leaders. You are currently a member of the Global Futures Council for Complex Risk, and among others, you're also a senior advisor at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and a columnist for Jordan News. So you don't only know the private sector, you've also worked in public service, among others as a senior analyst in the Foreign Affairs Directorate in the office of His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan. And from your background and your studies, you're very international, and you hold degrees in Near East Studies from Princeton University, and you did your undergrad degree in Environmental Science and Policy and Business Management from Clark University. So today we're going to talk about two main topics. First, of course, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East region, most particularly between Israel and the Hamas. And second, we want to also throw some light on the bigger picture in the region and talk about the more general dynamics and developments in the whole Middle East region. Before we come to that, Nasser, given the current situation and the Gaza war, the terrorist attacks against Israel, but also, of course, the war between Israel and the Hamas, and all the other proxy developments in the regions, what is your current view on the Middle East, and what do you expect to see in the coming month? So basically, what is happening currently in the Middle East?
Thank you for having me again, Timo. It's a pleasure. And I just want to maybe remark that it has been a few years since my university degrees, and maybe I'm not so much a young global leader anymore, maybe youngish. I'd also just want to point out that despite my different affiliations, any of the comments or remarks that I share with you here today don't represent those of any organization, my personal remarks. And yes, unfortunately, my region continues to be a hotbed of instability, but that's shouldn't necessarily be the case, because the region has all the requisites of being a flourishing region that is at peace and living side by side with a stable and peaceful Europe as well. And I find that increasingly we do share a common destiny as our two regions.
Maybe if we directly dive into that, Nasser, at the beginning, what is basically your understanding of the current dynamics and your assessment of the current political and geoeconomic developments that we see in the Middle East region. So obviously the hotspots at the moment are Israel, Gaza, Iran. What's your take on that? What are the key issues really at the moment?
Well, I think, Timo, you're right in saying that the current hotspot is what's happening in Gaza, but it's actually just a reminder that this isn't an issue that is current by any means, because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian question is the region's key issue and over the past 70 odd years. And without resolving it in a just and comprehensive manner, we will continue to have conflict and instability like the period that we are witnessing now, although I would say it is unprecedented in terms of the scale and scope of the violence that we are seeing and the impact that it is having across the region. So if you were to ask me what my assessment of the current situation is, I think we have to always look back and look at the roots of this crisis and think how we can maybe think proactively, or maybe conceptually at least proactively, on how we can resolve it. And the only way I see towards the peace and stability across the region, not just in Israel and Palestine, is the just resolution of this conflict along internationally recognized parameters and the establishment of an independent and contiguous Palestinian state, and addressing legitimate Palestinian grievances, I think would be the solution. If I were to just take a little step back down memory lane, I think many in Israel in the past decades, say the 90s period, came to the realization that security can only really be achieved through peace. And this is why many Israeli leaders took the step, the courageous step, I would say, of finding a accommodation with the Palestinians, with Israel's neighbors, with looking at peace as a strategic necessity for Israel, for Israel's future. That formula has been flipped upside down by more recent Israeli leaders, such that the predominant thinking in Israel is that security will bring peace. And obviously that's very short-sighted. And I think the events of October 7th underscore this, because despite the billions and billions of dollars that were put into Israel's physical security in terms of the very sophisticated wall separating Gaza and the rest of Israel, there were still attacks because there were unresolved, legitimate political grievances by the Palestinians. And so I see this as being the crux of the issue. And no matter what we do in terms of skirting around it, we'll always come back to this issue. I think on some level, the Israelis were looking at the broader region, maybe trying to engage with countries of the GCC, leapfrogging this issue, so to speak, and in some way kind of desiring to make the Palestinians and this Palestinian issue disappear to a certain extent. It was about the negation of the Palestinians. And this was a delusion. And I think the attacks of October 7th shattered that delusion. You cannot continue to deny the existence of the Palestinians. And I think Israeli leaders need to shape public opinion along these lines.
GCC, we should mention, is the Gulf Cooperation Council, so basically the community of the Arabic states. In such a situation where there is so much human suffering on both sides and also so much distrust and hate probably, Nasser, in your experience from international relations, international negotiations, how do you start in rebuilding trust in such an environment?
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question, and many people would even characterize it as unrealistic to a certain extent, given what we've seen. I think there are things that can be done on the longer term that we can talk about a little bit later. But on the shorter term, I think the most pressing issue is to reach a ceasefire agreement along the lines of what President Biden had floated earlier on in the year. And I think this agreement can be forced on both sides by the US if they were so inclined to do so. An absence of that, of such an agreement that would end the fighting today and lead to the release of Israeli hostages. Short of that, there will be no prospect for any longer-term trust building or confidence building. I'm not sure whether we have reached the point where it is irreparable, but many people across the region, including myself sometimes, think it is. I think that is the case. But to them, I would say that the one sort of possible opportunity or historical, rather, analogy to look at is that this change in Israeli thinking historically during the peace era, so to speak, if such an era did in fact exist, it did come on the back at the end of other periods of violence and Israeli atrocities as well in the first Intifada, but also in southern Lebanon in the late 80s. So perhaps what we see happening right now in this conflict will lead to an awakening and a realization among Israelis that the current situation is simply untenable and that the status quo and that it is impossible to maintain this status quo definitely.
It seems at the moment in the ongoing negotiation that one Israeli key request is to leave their soldiers at the border between Egypt and Gaza. In your view and also from your understanding about Egyptian politics, is this a realistic request? Is this something which can be mutually be agreed on, or where do you see this going?
I don't think that's viable, to be honest. I think any permanent Israeli military presence in Gaza is not an option that would be accepted by anyone in the region. I think from an Israeli perspective, there is some adventurous thinking or desires to maintain some presence. I have my own theories about what I think the Israeli ambitions are in Gaza vis-a-vis Eastern Mediterranean gas reserves and Israel's desire to become a the main Eastern Mediterranean gas hub as a supplier to Europe and the Middle East. And I think right now the Israeli Prime Minister, his government, or majority of his government, have these designs on Gaza and want to use this current period of chaos to try to get as much as they can in terms of this current military campaign. But it is unclear what it could look like the day after, so to speak.
You've mentioned the current Israeli government. If we have a deeper look on Israeli politics, and obviously the Israeli Prime Minister is also under pressure. He stays in power as long as the conflict is ongoing, but there will be a point in time when he also has to justify himself for the Israeli defense or non-defense during the Palestinian attacks. So how do you see at the moment the Israeli population, their domestic attitudes and their support of the current ongoing Israeli government, which is middle right-wing government at the moment?
Yeah, I think also maybe looking a little bit further back, I would accuse the current Israeli Prime Minister of leading us to the situation that we find ourselves in today. And by that, I specifically mean he has worked tirelessly to undermine Palestinian Authority and undermine his peace partners as well. He has done a lot of harm in terms of consolidating decision-making in Israeli decision-making circles, such that his viewpoints and that any dissenting or contrarian voices are sidelined or marginalized. And he has done what other populist leaders do everywhere, which is that they act as a thermometer of sorts by reflecting public opinion, no matter how harsh it is, rather than doing what leaders should be doing, which is acting more like a thermostat, which is shaping public opinion. So he has, I think, done a lot of damage to how Israelis view the Palestinians. He has been increasingly behaving in an autocratic fashion. And yes, I think, as you rightly pointed out, the day the fighting ends is his day of reckoning with the Israeli public over the intelligence and security failures that led to October 7th. So he will try to prolong this sort of conflict and Israel's war footing, or this atmosphere of conflict, because he knows that his day of reckoning would come shortly thereafter. And in terms of the broader picture, I think he is trying to get as much as he can during the current period, and he will eventually be scapegoated and say, well, this was all Netanyahu all along, and now we can start afresh. But with a new leader, with a more accommodating leader, but I really don't think it's going to be business as usual. I think even to a certain extent, the U.S. think that, or the U.S. disregards to a certain extent the damage that this conflict has created to their standing in the region. And they believe that a mixture of diplomacy and good PR with some good lobbyists and PR firms will somehow salvage the situation, and maybe in 5, 10, 15 years, things will be back to normal. And I would second guess that assumption.
We've talked already about the specific conflict at the moment between Israel and Gaza, and you mentioned the US. So if we zoom out a bit of this conflict and look at the broader picture in the whole region, where do you see specifically on that the role of the US at the moment, and how does it shift, or has it shifted over time throughout the last 10 years then?
Well, I think at a certain point in time, there was this thinking in the U.S. That the region is maybe relegated to a secondary priority. There was the U.S. Pivot to Asia. There was the formal conclusion of the U.S. Counterterrorism mission. But ultimately, the region continues time and time again to show its centrality to global security because of this ongoing conflict and because of other factors as well. So I think the US cannot disengage from the region in the way that it wants to be. And I think to a certain extent, the Israelis had somehow convinced the Americans that they can take over security in the region to a certain extent. And they said, you're disengaging, you have your other priorities, we'll manage the region. So I say this with air quotes. We have a considerable we have a considerable military. We can reach targets anywhere. Just leave the region to us. And I think that backfired considerably in some sense on October 7th. And on another front, many countries in the region also began to raise doubts about the reliability of the US as a security partner. And sought to improve their security ties with Israel because Israel was this new guarantor of the region. But that too fell through on October 7th, and that illusion was shattered. So what will the US engagement in the region look like in the future? I'm not so sure, but I think they have to move away from this crisis management mentality and look to really build something that's lasting and secure and stable. And the key central issue of the region will always be the Palestinian question. And if it is addressed in a way that is, as I mentioned earlier, just and comprehensive, this will be the key to regional security, and there's no skirting around that issue.
Okay, it's a new strategic power play, basically, and a new strategic concept that would be required, and the understanding in the US that dynamics in the regions are actually shifting and their role has to shift as well.
So I think so, but it's also, I think, there have been changes in the US approach to the region over the years, whereas especially when it comes to the thinking that this security approach can somehow resolve issues. This military first approach can somehow manage the issue, and we forget about these other tools, which are, I think, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, way more effective, these diplomatic tools. When the US has shown leadership and has flexed its diplomatic muscles, it has been able to achieve significant things in the region. When it has depended solely on its military tools and instruments as a primary factor of their foreign policy, it has failed miserably. And I think those lessons have to be, if I may say so in my own humble opinion, internalized when it comes to policy formulation for the region.
We have the major elections in the US coming up. Would you expect the President Harris to be smarter about the region than a potential return of Donald Trump?
Well, it's not for me to say, Timo. What I would say is that people across the region are disillusioned by the U.S., regardless of who is occupying the White House, because there was this brief period of respite when President Biden came to power, with people believing this would sort of reverse Trump-era positions about the region. And now the region see President Biden as presiding over what people see as a genocide in Gaza. And I think there's not only a tremendous amount of demoralization across the region, but a disillusionment with the U.S. role. And this idea that maybe a democratic presidency would be liberal or somehow have more of an interest in finding using diplomacy or diplomatic tools to resolve this conflict. I think nobody thinks along those lines anymore in the region, unfortunately.
When we leave a bit the role of the US and look towards China, China has a strong global agenda. They see themselves as a global power, of course. They want to sit on the table and for a solution in the Russian-Ukrainian war. They have their ambitions in Europe, and of course they are in a strategic rivalry with the United States. How would you say is the role China in the Middle East, of course, specifically the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza, but also more on a broader agenda? Do they play a significant role, or are they just starting to play a role? They had they had the success of the diplomatic handshake between Saudi Arabia and Iran last year, and they also have close ties, for example, to countries like Qatar. They're also buying their natural gas. They rely on the Middle East region also in more general, for energy supply. So maybe if we switch from the US, if their role is changing and going down, is China's role rising, or is this not the case?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons, returning to your earlier question, one of the reasons why the region will continue to be so critical is because it's the area of superpower competition, great power competition historically, and it will always be the case. I think definitely China's relations with the region have improved considerably over the past decade or two, and China has definitely reaped the benefits of for U.S. policymaking in the region, and it continues to have continues to be seen a lot in a lot more of a positive light than the U.S. And I would maybe refer you to the Arab Barometer report, which is an annual report measuring these kinds of perceptions in the region, which shows that China continues to be seen in a more positive light than the U.S. and surprisingly even Russia as well. And I think that's because of this military interventionist history that the U.S. has had in the region. Superpowers continue to see the region solely through three lenses. It's energy resources, its strategic trade routes, including its waterways, and its markets for our products, namely arms. The Chinese have been expanding their economic footprint and their profile in the region. And I think this has been welcomed by the region because of China's, I think, financial muscle and business muscle, and its willingness to invest in a wide range of sectors in a way that Western powers might hesitate to do. Having said that, I don't see China being interested in replacing the US in the region, nor do I see them as being interested in wanting to have any role policing the region, so to speak, playing the role of a security guarantor. But as with the case that you mentioned in terms of the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, China will always seek to use its good offices and leverage to stabilize the region, partly for the reason you mentioned, which is they want a stable region because they also want to be able to access markets in the region and ensure their security of supply for their energy requirements.
Nasser, these were actually three very clear bullets when you say international powers see the region through three things: energy, trade routes, and markets, specifically for arms. And how would you say international power should see the region, or how do you see it? What would be your three bullets? What characterizes the region most?
Yeah, that's a great question, Timo, and I might not have an answer for that. But what I would maybe say how I wish we were viewed is that let's take Europe for an example, which is a neighboring region. I think from a European perspective, a European national security perspective, there needs to be a realization that the stabilization of this region is actually something that will further the national security of Europe. And I think this idea of sharing a common destiny is precisely what I meant by that. We can't continue to live in isolation of others, and I think this was the mistake of Israelis in a number of ways, denying the suffering of the Palestinians or the existence of the Palestinians, constructing and erecting these walls, and somehow accepting to be living alongside human misery and expecting that it would not impact your security going forward, I think is short-sighted. So if I was to say, how international partners should change their outlook about the region, I just think it would be that, the construct, the paradigm in which the international powers look at the region.
So interestingly, from an economic perspective, at least I would say in France and Germany, but also other countries, at least companies specifically look, for example, on the United Arab Emirates as a business partner increasingly. Also, they look towards the markets in Saudi Arabia. We've seen that in terms of technology and the ambitions for technology, also regarding an own space program, cutting edge biotechnology and others, we really see great advantages in the region. So would you say are really the innovation drivers in the region? And would you share the perspective that actually in this regard, businesses and economics are changing at least parts of the perspective other nations have on specifically countries which started from energy and oil and are going more into the tech sectors?
Yeah, I think definitely businesses have a role in shaping the trajectory of the region, but I don't like to see it in the context of companies coming to sort of invest in a project here or there, but maybe look at it in a more grander scheme of things, which is a partnership, because the region has very strong finances at a time when Europe might be, or certainly the Gulf countries have tremendous financing possibilities at a time when Europe and others are maybe lacking in terms of their access to finance. Meanwhile, Europe might have access to technologies or might have a better tech ecosystem to address some of the most pressing issues of our time. And climate security comes top of mind for if I were to give an example. I mean, it's the partnership between European firms and their region's capabilities that I think will unlock really innovative solutions to climate security. And given the region's energy transition, we are in the most critical climate hotspot. And we are in desperate need, I think, as a region of innovative technologies and approaches to address this. So I think this is a good idea, good example of what I mean. It's this partnership, which I don't think it should simply be viewed as business opportunities, is what I'm trying to say. But yes, the region has historically had to innovate to survive, even from ancient times. And I think technology is key in that regard.
We often talk about, of course, Israel, Iran, and in the greater Middle East region, and then Saudi Arabia, the Arabic Emirates, or also Qatar, but not that often on Jordan. But actually, Jordan is a close ally to the US, also to Western countries. It's in the center of the region. Maybe, Nasser, you could give us just a bit more background also on the future coming years regarding Jordan. I think the country has, of course, gained in importance throughout the last years. It becomes a bit more also Amman, a tourist destination. There are a few, for example, also energy-related projects and so on. So where do you see the role of Jordan? What could it be, and what are key trends in the country which you see at the moment?
Yeah, Timo, I think that Jordan is very much held hostage to the broader regional developments, and specifically what is happening between Israelis and the Palestinians. And I think its prospects to thrive are very much contingent on the resolution of this conflict. Its ability to survive, on the other hand, has been tested time and time again, and Jordan has proved its resilience in surviving one regional crisis to another. Unfortunately, it's this regional disruption that makes it very difficult for Jordan to thrive. If we look at the past 3 decades alone, Jordan has received 10 to 20% of its population as refugees during the Syrian conflict, during the US invasion of Iraq, and during the first Gulf War in 1990. So that's 10 to 20% every decade. And that kind of disruption and that kind of shock would be very difficult for any country to absorb and navigate. it would be the equivalent in terms of percentage-wise of the population of Canada moving into the United States, just to give some context. And then ever since 1948, we've had a major regional conflict on average every 10 years. And Jordan tends to end up paying the price of this conflict. So there's there's a lot of difficulty in having any kind of plan for energy projections, for water projections, for education, for health, given these types of stresses and shocks on the one hand. But then, it becomes increasingly a challenge to simply host these communities as refugees, because there is a limited carrying capacity in terms of how much can be absorbed in terms of the health, water, and energy infrastructure. Jordan imports 7% of its energy from abroad. It's the second or third water poorest country in the world. So there are, I think, opportunities when we look at technologies, new renewable technologies, nuclear desalination, things along those lines. But maybe financial climate or the ability of the government to realize those projects is strained. And so I think there really needs to be some renewed international commitment to Jordan's growth and development. If you look at public schools, for example, they're on 2 shifts or 3 shifts in some cases, because they have to accommodate so many new students who are refugees in Jordan. International commitments towards alleviating refugees have declined, and fortunately, it seems to be an issue that many have forgotten about. The current conflict has only exacerbated the situation. You mentioned tourism. We're hopeful that there would be a slow recovery in tourism following COVID, but this conflict has really taken a toll on tourism as a revenue. So I think, in a nutshell, maybe that's a very long answer to your question. It's very much dependent on what happens in the region.
We've talked about different topics, Nasser, from the conflict and the general dynamics in the region to climate security and economic developments. If we say you would become foreign minister of Jordan from tomorrow on, can you tell us what would be your first 3 actions that you would immediately do, apart from your first trip, of course, to Bavaria as your starting state visit?
Well, I don't know how I would maybe answer that question, but Bavaria would definitely be top of mind. I think in general, Jordan's facing numerous challenges on multiple fronts. And I think if I were to be able to weigh in on what Jordan's priorities should be from a thematic perspective, I think it's climate, I think it's refugees, and I think it's countering drug trafficking and narcotics, because those are the 3 primary sort of issues that Jordan needs to be focused on. We spoke about climate, we spoke about refugees, and countering narcotics is something that I might maybe use this few minutes to touch on. Jordan is currently witnessing a concerted effort by the Syrian regime to smuggle heptagon, which is a synthetic drug, into Jordan. And this is wreaking havoc Jordanian society. The size of the problem is actually much larger, maybe than the authorities think or would like to think. And it is the first time in history that we have such a narco state. And I'll qualify that a little bit further. In the case of Latin America, for example, it was the cartels that controlled the state. But in our current context, it is actually the state that is involved in the production and distribution of drugs. So it's the weaponization of drugs as a tool of foreign policy. So I would, if I had any say, sort of shaping Jordan's outlook or priority for the coming period, everything would revolve around those three themes or those three pillars. And obviously, within those, water and energy, or the nexus between water and energy, would also be obviously critical as well.
That was Nasser bin Nasser. Thank you very much for your insights and your view on the current developments in the Middle East region. And thank you all very much for listening to our 20th episode, and the next one will follow as usual throughout the next weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Timo. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing Agora's next podcasts as well.
Thank you, Nasser. Yeah, we'll make sure there are a few English sessions included.